You assume that when an institution receives repeated evidence that something's failing, it fixes it. Reports come in, the problem gets acknowledged, the correction follows. That's how responsible systems are supposed to work. Richard Feynman spent 50 years documenting why that's dead wrong, and the story begins with a torpedo. It was 1942, the Pacific was on fire, and American submarines were sinking enemy ships with an impressive frequency. At least, that's what the official report said. The reality, discovered by commanders returning from patrol, was completely different. The torpedoes weren't working. Not in the way you'd think. It wasn't occasional failures. It wasn't combat bad luck or the wear and tear of war. It was systematic, repeated, documented in dozens of reports sent back by submariners risking their lives on every dive. They fired. The torpedo went on its way. Nothing happened. The Mark 14 was the Navy's standard torpedo. It had cost millions to develop. It had undergone extensive testing before combat approval. And unbeknownst to the men who depended on it, it was one of the most effective weapons America's arsenal has ever produced. In 1941, when the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, submariners in the Pacific began noticing the problem almost immediately. A torpedo that was supposed to cruise at a specific depth was clearly failing. Targets that should have been destroyed kept right on sailing. In some cases, commanders reported hearing the impact, a clear, dry thud, followed by nothing. In others, the torpedo simply vanished without detonating. The reports reached the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance with a disturbing consistency, and the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance had a consistent response for all of them: operator error. The submarine commanders were wrong. They were poorly trained. They were exaggerating the problems. They were mishandling the equipment. The problem, according to the official authority responsible for the torpedo, was not the torpedo. Think about what that means. Men trained for years, risking their lives on every mission, coming back with detailed reports of specific, repeatable failures. And the institutional response? They're the problem. The lab experts know better than the actual combat operators what's happening with the equipment. This went on for 2 years. 2 years of submarines sent into the Pacific with a torpedo that didn't work, while the authorities kept insisting everything was fine. This video isn't about the technical fix. It's about why it took 2 years for someone to actually test if the torpedo worked. And the answer Feynman gave one of the most important ideas a scientist ever articulated about how knowledge fails. You'll recognize it in every system you've ever been part of. To understand why it took 2 years and what this reveals about how knowledge systematically fails, you need to meet a 24-year-old physicist who arrived at Los Alamos, New Mexico in 1943. For a young physicist, it was the most unlikely and extraordinary invitation imaginable, a secret facility in a remote desert where the best scientists of their generation were working on a project that could change the course of the war and of history. Feynman wasn't the type you'd expect from a future giant of science. He came from far Rockaway, Queens, middle-class New York, not the typical breeding ground for Nobel laureates. He studied at MIT and then Princeton, where his talent in theoretical physics was obvious to everyone around him. But what set him apart wasn't just intelligence, it was how he used it. Feynman didn't believe in authority. Not naively, he worked under Hans Bethe at Los Alamos and respected him enormously as a scientist. What he rejected was authority as a substitute for evidence. The idea that a claim's truer because someone important said it. That a result's valid because a committee approved it. That a system's safe because it's supposed to be. This distinction seems simple. In practice, it's extraordinarily rare. At Los Alamos, Feynman quickly became famous for a set of pranks that on the surface seemed like just eccentric entertainment. He cracked safes. Classified safes. Safes holding documents from the most secret project in the world. Not with tools, not with violence, with observation, hypothesis, and testing. Feynman had noticed something. People chose combinations from a very predictable set of patterns. Birth dates, famous mathematical constants, obvious number sequences, and, with remarkable frequency, they simply left the factory default combination unchanged. He studied the patterns, formulated hypotheses about which would be most likely for each person, and tested systematically. And he got in. After cracking a safe containing top-secret documents from the Manhattan Project, Feynman took nothing. Instead, he left a note inside. It wasn't vanity. It was a point. The safe security was a performance, an illusion that made everyone feel safe, without anyone actually testing if the protection worked. It looked secure. It conveyed security. It had every appearance of being secure. But it was wide open to anyone who bothered to check. The question Feynman was asking with every cracked safe was the same question he would ask about the torpedo, about scientific programs, about NASA. Do you actually know this works? Or did you just assume it works because someone said it was supposed to? When that kind of mind turned its attention to the Mark 14, the outcome was inevitable. To understand what was wrong with the Mark 14, you have to understand the scale of the failure. It wasn't just one thing. It was three independent things, each capable of rendering the torpedo useless on its own, all operating simultaneously. The first flaw was in the depth control. The torpedo was designed to run at a specific depth set before launch. In practice, it consistently ran 10 feet deeper than configured. 10 feet doesn't sound like much until you understand what it means in practical terms. The torpedo passed directly under the hulls of target ships without touching them. In many cases, submariners watching through their periscopes saw exactly what they were supposed to see: correct trajectory, correct timing, perfect position, and then just nothing. The torpedo vanished beneath the ship and kept right on going. This specific problem had a particularly cruel twist. The Mark 14's depth control mechanism used water pressure to regulate the torpedo's position. In tests conducted in calm harbor waters, it worked fine. In open ocean conditions, with the pressure variations caused by waves, currents, and the torpedo launch itself, the mechanism misread the depth and adjusted in the wrong direction. The engineers who had designed the system never tested it in conditions that replicated actual combat. The second flaw was the magnetic exploder designed to detonate the torpedo as it passed under a ship, triggered by the hull's magnetic field. In theory, brilliant. No need for a direct hit. Detonate under the keel for maximum damage. In practice, way too sensitive. It'd detonate early, sometimes before even reaching the target. A torpedo man hearing the detonation might think he'd scored, but the target kept right on sailing. Imagine you're the commander. You heard the impact. You saw the torpedo follow the perfect trajectory, and the ship just keeps on sailing. But then you discover that even if the first two flaws didn't exist, even if the torpedo had run at the right depth and the magnetic exploder hadn't gone off early, there was a third flaw waiting to make sure nothing would work anyway. The third flaw was the cruelest. It destroyed the backup system. The contact exploder was the fail-safe. If the magnetic exploder failed, detonate on impact. But the firing pins were too fragile for a perpendicular hit, exactly the most common angle in real combat. At 90 degrees, the pins snapped before they could detonate the warhead. Consider that for a moment, a torpedo that runs too deep to hit the target, with an exploder that detonates too early as it approaches, and a backup system that breaks on direct impact. Any one of these flaws alone would have been a scandal. All three operating at the same time turns the weapon into something bordering on the absurd. Roughly 70% of Mark 14 torpedoes fired early in the Pacific War were defective or underperforming. 70%. Submariners were going into combat with a weapon that didn't work most of the time. And every single one of these flaws had been reported. Each one had reached the Bureau of Ordnance with documentation, with specific descriptions from commanders, with real combat data, and each one had been met with the exact same conclusion: Operator error. How does that happen 3 times in a row? How does an institution receive evidence of repeated failure, with extensive documentation from experienced operators, and consistently arrive at the conclusion that the problem lies with the operators? Imagine you've spent 10 years developing something. Your career's tied to it. Your department relied on that budget. Your name's on the approval documents. Now someone from the field says it doesn't work. What's easier to believe, that you got everything wrong, or that they're wrong? That was exactly the position of the Bureau of Ordnance. And the answer they gave wasn't a conspiracy. It was something far more insidious than a conspiracy. The Bureau wasn't full of fools. Competent engineers, dedicated administrators, bureaucrats who genuinely believed they were doing their jobs right. The problem wasn't incompetence, it was something harder to fix. The Mark 14 took years to develop. It had cost significant public money. It had been approved after extensive testing and validation. Entire careers were invested in its success. The agency's reputation was tied to the Torpedoes' performance. Then reports come in saying it doesn't work, which is easier to believe. That the whole development process produced a fundamentally flawed weapon, meaning the process was wrong, approvals were misguided, careers built on false ground, or that combat operators were exaggerating the problems. The institutional response protected the status quo. It needed the minimum revision to existing assumptions. There were times when the evidence became so overwhelming that it was hard to ignore. In some particularly well-documented combat episodes, commanders presented accounts so specific and consistent that even the Bureau's defenders struggled to explain them away. The usual response in those moments wasn't more testing, but more justifications. Analyses that found alternative ways to interpret the data. Patterns demonstrating that the issues were rarer than the report suggested. This has a technical name confirmation bias, but in institutions, it goes beyond individual psychology. The system develops something like an immune system. Any information threatening core assumptions gets recognized as a threat and neutralized, not out of bad faith necessarily, but through individual decisions that seem reasonable in isolation, but collectively reject the truth. By mid-1943, combat failures piled up enough that blaming it all on operator error became impossible. The Navy finally ordered independent tests, and in controlled experiments, all 3 flaws confirmed simultaneously. The torpedo had been defective all along. The commanders had been right all along. The reports had been accurate all along. And for 2 years, while proper tests weren't being conducted, while the official explanation remained operator error, American submariners were fighting with a weapon that didn't work. Missions failed that could have succeeded. Strategic opportunities were lost. In some cases, the torpedo's failure put the submarines themselves in danger, when attacks that should have destroyed targets simply revealed the submarine's position without causing any damage. The torpedo was fixed fast once someone actually tested it. The technical flaws corrected quickly once identified. The solution wasn't complicated. Getting to the point of admitting testing was necessary, that was complicated. This was what bothered Feynman. Not the technical flaw, the institutional refusal to look. Feynman wasn't assigned to investigate the torpedoes. That was a naval issue, and he was in a secret physics program. But the problem drew him the same way the safes did. A system declared secure, approved as functional, trusted as reliable, and the field data said otherwise. To Feynman, this was an invitation. The pattern he observed was nothing new to him. In practice, it was what his cracked safes demonstrated in miniature. When Feynman cracked a safe, he wasn't just showing off, he was demonstrating methodology. The sequence was always the same: identify what assumptions people made about security, test whether they were true. Reveal the result, not as an accusation, as information. The safes were secure because people assumed they were, not because they'd verified it. That difference That's the difference between actual security and the performance of security. That's what the Bureau of Ordnance did with the Mark 14. Created a performance of validation tests under controlled conditions that confirmed performance in situations that didn't replicate actual combat. Produced documentation indicating approval. Built an elaborate system with the appearance of rigor, but without the underlying rigor that would make it meaningful. The language Feynman would eventually use for this, it'd take him 30 more years to find it, came from an unexpected place. After the war, Feynman returned to physics and built the career that had earned him the Nobel Prize in 1965 for quantum electrodynamics work. But he kept thinking about the torpedo problem. It wasn't isolated. The refusal to test, the institutional immune system neutralizing inconvenient evidence, the confusion between the performance of rigor and actual rigor. He saw this pattern everywhere. And in 1974, in a commencement address at Caltech, Feynman finally found the perfect metaphor. During World War II, the Pacific Islands had been transformed by American military operations. Air bases sprang up out of nowhere, with planes arriving loaded with equipment, food, and supplies of all kinds. The local communities on some islands watched this phenomenon with genuine astonishment. And when the war ended and the bases were demobilized, the planes stopped coming. But the memories remained. In some communities, something extraordinary happened. Inhabitants built replicas of what they'd observed. Wooden airstrips, control towers, radio equipment carved from bamboo. They performed elaborate ceremonies mimicking the soldiers who'd operated the real bases. And they waited for the planes to return. Feynman's observation was sharp. These rituals perfectly captured the form of aeronautical operations without any of the function. The participants understood there was a relationship between the activities on the bases and the arrival of the planes. But they didn't understand the underlying mechanism, and without that understanding, the most elaborate replica was completely ineffective. Cargo cult science, Feynman called it. There are fields and institutions that perform all the external rituals of scientific rigor, peer review, approval committees, data collection, credentialed experts, publications. But they systematically avoid the exact test that'd reveal whether their conclusions are true. They build the wooden airstrips of the scientific method without the mechanism that makes it work. Feynman was specific. Nutritional research where funding influenced results. Educational psychology, where programs were validated by studies the programs themselves commissioned. Parapsychology, where verification protocols were tweaked until they produced desired results. In every case, the form was there. The function was absent. Feynman's criterion was simple, but radical. A real scientist tries harder to prove themselves wrong than right. They actively report results that contradict their hypotheses. They share information that weakens their conclusions. Because the point isn't being right, it's finding out what's true. Absolute honesty, Feynman said, not as an abstract virtue, as the only mechanism that distinguishes real knowledge from the performance of knowledge. The Bureau of Ordnance had built wooden airstrips. They had committees, tests, documentation, experts. They were missing the one thing that made it real, the willingness to find out they were wrong. Feynman gave this speech in 1974. The pattern he described, he'd observed it at the Bureau of Ordnance 30 years earlier. He'd demonstrated it with cracked safes. And 12 years after this speech, that same pattern would kill 7 people live on television. On January 28, 1986, at 11:38 a.m., the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. 73 seconds later, it exploded. The technical cause was quickly identified. A rubber seal in the right solid rocket booster, known as an O-ring, had failed in the cold temperatures of the launch morning, allowing hot combustion gases to escape and detonate the external fuel tank. Feynman was added to the Rogers Commission, the official panel appointed to investigate the disaster. While other commission members did what commissions do, reviewed documentation, listened to presentations, followed protocol, Feynman went straight to the engineers. He didn't want managers. He wanted people who actually understood the system. What he found was shocking, not because nobody expected problems. It was shocking because it matched exactly what someone who'd seen the Bureau of Ordnance and developed cargo cult science theory would expect to find. The engineers estimated the probability of a catastrophic failure of the space shuttle at roughly 1 in 100, 1%. For a human transport system, that is extraordinarily high, but it was the honest assessment of the people who knew the technology. NASA management estimated the probability of failure at 1 in 100,000. Think about that difference for a moment. If you flew on the Challenger 100 times with the engineers' numbers, you'd expect a tragedy. With management's numbers, you could make 100,000 flights and never see a failure. These two numbers aren't different readings of the same data. They are completely different worlds. And NASA management didn't arrive at that number through engineering analysis. They got it because it was the number needed to maintain political support and the launch schedule, the performance of confidence, the wooden airstrip. The engineers knew about the O-ring problem in low temperatures. They'd raised concerns before launch. The forecasted temperature for Challenger launch morning was below the minimum safe level they themselves identified. They recommended postponing. Management decided to proceed. What Feynman did next became one of the most memorable moments in public institutional accountability. During a televised hearing, he asked for ice water. He'd brought an O-ring piece. He dipped it in cold water, waited, pulled it out, and showed the cameras how the material lost its elasticity and failed to return to its original shape at low temperature. A complex technical issue made immediate and understandable in 30 seconds, live on television. But the O-ring demonstration wasn't his most important contribution. That was his minority appendix to the Rogers Commission report, a document NASA and some members wanted suppressed. Feynman threatened to pull his name from the full report unless it was included. The appendix didn't just say the O-ring failed. It stated NASA developed a management culture that systematically inflated reliability and safety estimates to maintain political support. That there was a structural divide between engineers who knew the technical realities and managers who made launch decisions. That the decision-making process was built to produce the answer the program needed, not discover the truth. Cargo cult science, with 7 names: Krista McAuliffe, Gregory Jarvis, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Michael Smith, Francis Scobie. The final line Feynman wrote in that appendix: "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." Feynman was diagnosed with kidney cancer in the mid-1980s and died February 15, 1988, age 69, months after the Challenger Commission. He knew he was dying as he wrote that appendix. 7 names, 1 final sentence, and a question that won't go away. If the same mechanism that broke the torpedo, that kept the wooden landing strips, that ignored the engineers' warnings, if this mechanism is the default behavior of any institution under pressure, what exactly did he find? The title says, "What Feynman found is disturbing." You probably expected something technical, a hidden military secret, a covert conspiracy, something about the physics of torpedoes or nuclear weapons. Feynman found nothing about torpedoes. What he found was this: institutions have structural incentives not to discover they're wrong. Not because the people are bad, not because of conspiracies, but because the cost of being wrong is immediate and heavy. Careers at risk, wasted resources, compromised prestige, while the benefits of maintaining the illusion you're right are equally immediate. The Bureau wasn't lying when it blamed operator error. It was reaching the conclusion the incentive system made easiest. The reports weren't ignored out of malice. They were filtered through an institutional process that associated belief in the torpedo with professionalism and loyalty. NASA's engineers weren't silenced by conspiracy. They were overruled by a management system that treated launch schedules as non-negotiable and engineering risks as negotiable. And here's what Feynman found truly disturbing. These mechanisms aren't exceptions. They're the default. Any organization committed to its own continuation develops an immune system against threatening information. Medical bureaucracy, academic research, corporate product development, public policy, the forms vary. The mechanism's always the same. The only solution Feynman proposed wasn't more oversight, committees, accreditation, peer review, or documentation. It was this: the individual scientist, engineer, analyst, operator, refusing to let the institution think for them. The scientific integrity Feynman described wasn't an abstract virtue for extraordinary people. It was a concrete practice for anyone willing to do it. Try to prove yourself wrong before concluding you're right. Report results that weaken your conclusions, not just the ones that strengthen them. Maintain the distinction between what you know and what you've assumed. What made Feynman extraordinary wasn't the physics, although it was extraordinary. It was practicing this honesty where it cost. He didn't preach about the Bureau from safe distance. He kept testing assumptions within his institution, even about safety systems he depended on. He didn't save the methodology for convenient times. He applied it consistently, especially when inconvenient. On Challenger, with a failing body, in a politically delicate process, under pressure to preserve NASA's relationship with Congress, he insisted the appendix be included, that the truth be named, that the record be clear about what actually happened. People who knew Feynman best say the most Feynman thing about him wasn't the physics, bongo sessions, or cracked safes. It was never stopping asking what was actually true, even when the answer was inconvenient for everyone. It's disturbing to discover the torpedo was broken. It's far more disturbing to realize you're part of institutions operating on the exact same mechanisms, and they'll continue unless someone asks what Feynman asked. Did you actually check if it's locked? Not the genius, the safe guy. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to keep going in this direction, the next video is right here.